This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator who focuses on prints and printmaking. And that is what this podcast is all about, the printmaking ecosphere and the fine people who live in it. Today's guests are two people who have put together an exhibition that is on view at the Print Center, New York, as we speak. The title of the exhibition is A Model Workshop, Margaret Lowengrund and the Contemporaries. The curators are Rosenblum and Christina Weyl. Now, you guys have heard me talk about Christina Weyl in the past. She's the wonderful scholar who wrote the book on women at Atelier 17, for which I have a very soft spot, as you know. The exhibition that Lauren and Christina have put together focuses on a woman, Margaret Lowengrund, who is responsible for a mid-century New York print mecca called the Contemporaries, which combined not only a working space but also a gallery space. So it was kind of this special and new sort of print nexus. And lots of people came through there, taught there, took classes there, and showed there, and sold there, and did all that cool stuff. So she is somebody who's completely in need of an exhibition. And finally, the Print Center, New York, which is on 24th Street in Chelsea between 10th and 11th Avenues, is hosting this show. Before I get too far, I just want to mention that the exhibition is made possible with support from the Getty through their paper project initiative. Additional support is provided by the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Kalida A. Doolin Foundation, and the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation. If you're in New York, you ought to go see it because I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's a big show. They've put a huge amount of work into it, and they've produced a really beautiful catalog, so all worth it. All right, let's see. Positionality. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. If you love Platemark's content, please consider heading over to platemarkpodcast.com and hitting the support and donate button. Help me keep the lights on here. It's a one-woman show, and it takes a lot of work, and I don't get paid for it. So your support would be very, very much appreciated, and I thank you. All right, let's get rolling. Okay, hello everybody. It's Ann Shafer here for Platemark, and I have two wonderful guests today, Lauren Rosenblum and Christina Weyl, who have put together a fabulous show at the Print Center, New York. So, Lauren, tell us about the show. Well, tell us about yourself first.
Hi, Anne. This is Lauren. Thank you so much for having us. We're so happy to be here to talk to you about our exhibition that's opening at Print Center, New York, and will run through the fall. It's been a long time in coming. Christina and I have been collaborating for a while, so we're quite excited to see both the show in person and the catalog in person. It focuses on Margaret Lowengrund and her work at the Contemporaries.
Christina, tell us how you and Lauren met each other and how you got started on this project.
Well, thank you, Anne, for having us. It's nice to be here. I met Lauren, I think, through an event at the Association of Print Scholars. Just sort of kept in touch. And I think I remember speaking to you at some point about what your dissertation topic was about. And that was kind of simultaneous to me proposing an exhibition to what was then called IPCNY, the International Print Center of New York, about female master printers. As part of the feedback of proposing that show, we kind of narrowed it down to one person, and it happened to be Margaret Lowengrund, who I'd always had a really deep, fascination with. And it turned out that Margaret was also somebody that Lauren was writing about for their dissertation, so it felt like a natural pairing.
I feel like I had heard her name over the years. I've been dabbling in mid-century scholarship, I guess, sort of, and the Contemporaries and Pratt, but I had no idea it was such a convoluted and ever-changing story of places and names and addresses and people. It's really fascinating. All right, so who wants to start telling us about Margaret?
Well, Margaret is, in fact, a very interesting figure that unfortunately has been lost a little bit to time. I think Christina and I both, and perhaps you as well, Anne, have read about her because of her central importance and her being captured in the history of mid-century printmaking by scholars such as Clinton Adams, who himself had been a printer in the same period that Margaret was working and making prints as well. Margaret was born in Philadelphia. There she attended the Women's College, what is now known as Moore College, and then attended the Pennsylvania Academy, where in both schools she studied illustration. She was from a middle-class Jewish family, and so had some means and support in order to pursue a creative life. At the same time, she also began soon after working as a newspaper illustrator, ever set on being a professional woman, despite the fact that she also soon got married. Shortly after her marriage, she moved up to New York with her husband, or right around that same time, and enrolled at the Art Students League, where she continued to work and develop her artistry, as well as work for newspapers as a part of the Curtis publishing. So she moved from one Curtis newspaper to the next. And then she also became really immersed in the printmaking workshop of Joseph Pennell, who had arrived at the school only a couple years prior to really grow and develop the printmaking program at that school, which had been around for many decades, but had lapsed a little bit. And the school is quite proud of having recruited Pennell in his older years to both continue to promote etching, which had long been the favored medium, and then also develop a lithography program. Margaret was an early beneficiary of this introduction.
I feel like Pennell wasn't he kind of a jerk? Did I dream that?
I always say Pennell. I don't know which is right.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
All right, everybody.
Lauren is very, very clear in Pennell, and you said Pennell, so maybe it's Pennell. I don't know. I don't think he was a jerk. I think he was just kind of like of his generation, kind of a very strong-minded fellow who had opinions. You know, he had like very strong opinions. And if you read some of his writing, he had some somewhat racist thoughts, which is surprising because he was a Quaker, but that's where he was.
And it's to be also acknowledged, though, that at this time he held some, what some consider anti-Semitic thoughts as well. But nevertheless, he supported women in his printmaking workshop at the school quite wholeheartedly. And he himself was married to a very established professional woman. His wife, Elizabeth, was not only his biographer, posthumous biographer, but an art critic during their years in England and abroad.
Huh.
Oh, yeah. And there's this fantastic book, which I can just reach for, that if you're interested in her, you should read. Yes.
What's the title? I can't. What is that title?
Elizabeth Robbins Pennell, 19th Century Pioneer of Modern Art Criticism. Oh, so cool. If you'd like to learn more about her, there you go.
All right. Maybe we ought to back up and just, Christina, maybe you could summarize just a smidge of what women in mid-century New York would face trying to pursue a career in the arts, because you summarize it so eloquently in your book on Women at Atelier 17, which everyone should read immediately.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a good question. You know, I think everybody follows the general arc of women had more opportunities during the WPA, on the Federal Art Project. It was, I would say, a mixed bag. You know, women had a really hard time qualifying for the project. You had to substantiate, you know, your art credentials. You had to substantiate that you were the head of household. If you were married, your husband had priority to get on one of the relief programs. So women didn't account for exactly 50% of the, you know, project. I don't know what the overall statistic was, but at least in the graphic arts workshops, I think it was only 25%. So that's definitely not equal, but they did receive equal pay. And so coming out of that into the 40s, you know, I think women had a little bit more leeway during the war years because there were more opportunities for women to work outside the home as men were off, you know, fighting in the World War. As the war ended, there was this sort of regressive backlash against women out in the workforce. And so that's what you see in sort of the late 40s, early 50s, is this backlash against women being out in the workforce, and more traditional gender norms are being put in place. So to be a woman artist at this time was not easy because they had some opportunities, they had some places where they could go for training, but generally it was understood that once you got married, or definitely once you had kids, that you were just written off. You know, that would become your full-time job, that there was no way that you could juggle two things at one time. And many women, you know, I can think of a handful, really pushed back against this and did both and juggled professional and personal, but it wasn't an easy thing to do. You were always an oddity, and definitely called out in any art criticism or newspaper publication as being, both like beautiful to look at, look at what she's wearing, look at how her hair is done. I'm sure she's really good at making pies. And like, isn't her art really interesting?
I felt like a bunch of your artists that ended up in the Atelier 17 book never even had children, making that decision to be able to be free to create.
Some did and some didn't. You've got artists like Dorothy Daner, who never had children. But then you have some people who were moms. Minna Citron had older children, and so I guess she was sort of the beneficiary there. But you have others like Ruth Leaf, who had young kids at the time she was at the Atelier, and she had babysitting from her parents or her in-laws, and she would go. And I'm sure it was not an easy thing to do that, to leave her kids with her parents and go out and pursue something that wasn't going to make her money immediately.
Right. So, Lauren, do you want to describe the beginnings of the Contemporaries and how this all came together? It's an incredible story.
Sure. And I'll start by backtracking a little to go off of what Christina was talking about. One of the arguments that we're really trying to promote, and one of the takeaways we hope people get, is that Lowengrund's artistic life really mirrored the trajectory of 20th century printmaking overall. Her commitment early on to intaglio, then working on the project, her further commitment to socially progressive lithography, and then into the 1940s, where she also expanded into art criticism herself. So being on the other side and really being a voice in observing the changes taking place in the modern art world within New York, not just within printmaking itself, but among galleries, museums, with special attention to the exhibitions and museums that were also thinking not just about a modern print, but the ways in which historic printmaking fed modern ideas about the medium. So she herself stayed attuned to the progressions at mid-century. And then there is this off-cited incident where she's riding in a taxi cab uptown, observes the window that there is a gallery space or a space in Midtown that's empty, puts a hold on the taxi cab meter, goes inside and secures the space for the Contemporaries on the spot. The aggrandizement of this origin story is well appreciated, but to know that she was the first woman to bring together a commercial gallery and a printmaking workshops begs the question if she hadn't already been thinking strategically about the founding of such what would become a well-respected organization, a commercial venture. But it is quite romantic, and it does reflect the spark and enthusiasm that she brought to this task of securing funding, reaching through to her network of printmakers and artists to bring them and attract them to work at the Contemporaries, and the persistence that was required to ensure its success over time.
Yeah, I would just add that the taxi cab story, I don't think had been published before, and we were very lucky to find that little snippet in some of our archival research. It's like a great little story. And I think that's another really good takeaway from this exhibition, is that Margaret was not only an artist, she was not only an art critic, she was also just a really able organizer, and that's how she got this done. I mean, there's a certain class of women in the mid-century who were like this. They could see what the gaps were and they could come in and address them. I don't think Margaret had a particular amount of money, but somehow she was able to get people behind what she was doing.
So that you're saying that it was the first of its kind made me think, what is the landscape in the city in the early 50s before she's getting everything rolling? The Atelier sorry, everybody. The Atelier 17, which is run by Hayter, somebody that Christina and I have a shared interest in, didn't have a gallery space, although he was pretty good at organizing touring shows that would promote the artists who were working there. But were there other galleries that were doing printmaking at that point?
Well, we have an essay in the catalog written by a colleague named Jillian Russo, investigating what the landscape was of female gallery owners and in particular, thinking a little bit about what the avenues were for distributing and selling prints. And there were a handful of places, that I know from having worked on Atelier 17 where artists could get their stuff shown. So like one was sometimes the Via Gallery and Bookshop. One was the Wittenborn, sort of had a one wall, I think that's what they called it, for artists to show prints, but it was primarily a bookshop. And then there were a couple of other galleries that were like more open to showing prints, like Bertha Schaefer. Sometimes Mary Willard would show prints if it was one of her artists who she represented. Betty Parsons a little bit because she showed Anne Ryan. But like the opportunities were very, very small. And so when Margaret opened her gallery, it was really an opportunity for printmakers to fully show the work that they had been making recently. That's why she called it the Contemporaries, because it was all supposed to be contemporary work that had just been made. So it was a real opportunity. I think we tried really hard to show that it wasn't just about prints. She was showing paintings, and she was also very much showing sculpture. And she would often have duo shows and sometimes trio shows where there was work on paper on the wall, and then there was sculpture in the gallery by two different artists.
So ahead of our interview today, I somehow managed, gratefully, to get a PDF of the catalog, which is fantastic. Everybody should buy it when it comes out. There's some really great pictures in it. But there was this really interesting discussion of when there was the men / professional artists would be able to work at night in the workshop, and then the, amateur ladies who were dabbling could take over during the day. It was, I was laughing out loud, but it's just like, oh God, here we go. It's just so predictable, really, in the end. Oh.
Well, I think there was part that we sort of edited some of that stuff out. There's a longer story there. Margaret had a great business acumen, and she really did push classes for all different types of people when she was in charge of the workshop from 1951 to 1956. And she wanted the workshop to be used all the time and like to really capitalize on this space. So she did invite women to come in during the day and make prints. She even had children's classes. And I don't think that that's a horrible thing to do. And yet, when she died and the workshop had become Pratt, there was a lot of griping about that and about the fact that there were these so-called, dilettantes who were there during the day, and that was a detraction from the professional artists who weren't necessarily all men, but, definitely the women were called out for being in the day. But also how Margaret was able to substantiate the income and the potential of this workshop to get the grant that they got from the Rockefeller Foundation. If she hadn't been able to prove that there was need for this kind of a workshop, I'm not sure that the Rockefeller Foundation would have taken her as seriously as they did.
We'll backtrack and say, I apologize for not making it clear that it wasn't Margaret who was like, you little ladies should be downstairs during the daytime. It was, other people, men later.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we routinely encountered a kind of skewed reading of this past, one that's marked by a kind of gender bias of its time. And has been a great privilege to be able to both acknowledge then move the discourse beyond and give it some more detail and some more nuance.
Right. No, I agree. Yes, absolutely.
And another bit just to add, we edited this out as well, but there was this great exchange between June Wayne and Clinton Adams from later, because they were, I would say, friends, collaborators, obviously at Tamarind. They had a somewhat adversarial relationship in their later years. And June read Clinton Adams' book, with American Lithographers and Lithography, I think is the title, and saw the little bit about Margaret and was like, man, you're not giving her enough credit. When I think about what she did, dragging these men behind her, it's amazing, and you're not giving her enough credit.
Yeah. So maybe we should do a little sort of timeline of exactly what did happen, because it's convoluted, and maybe for our audience we should clarify.
Okay, so the Contemporaries, it starts in late 1951. Everybody says it begins in 1952, but it doesn't. It begins late 1951. She opens this space on Madison and 75th Street in a building that's just north of where the Whitney used to be. The building was raised sometime in the 50s to put up one of those white brick post-war buildings, where I think Christian Louboutin is now. But in any case, she was in a sort of second floor space where she had windows on Madison Avenue. It was a, quote, dumbbell shape, and she had in the front a gallery and in the back the workshop. And it was apparently very, very small. Like the workshop could maybe have 4 or 5 people in the space at any given time. And that's where she really launches the Contemporaries, and it stays there for 4 years. She's both having exhibitions. I forget what the number is, but I think she had over 100 exhibitions over that time. And she invited people to come and work in the back, to both take classes, to learn, to edition prints. It was a very active space. She had demonstrations. They did woodcut. They had Adjo Junkers there working. They had Siang Moy there teaching. They had lithography, and Michael Ponce de Leon was her sort of lithographer, and also taught intaglio. And then a few other people would rotate in and out. We've seen that Warden Day was there.
Christina, before you go on, when I read in the very few moments I had to skim the catalog today about the first address on 75th and Madison, I immediately went to see when the Breuer building was built, which wasn't until 1963. So it was still just old brownstones all the way up Madison Avenue at that point. But can you imagine when the Breuer building was built in 1963, what it did to the neighborhood? Oh, my God.
No,
Anyway,
I think that at the time it was very mixed. I think her neighbors were a flower shop and a bookstore and a furrier, and she had previously written a sort of summary of what she called the uptown art gallery scene. And there were a few people up there, like Via Gallery was up there. Park Burnett had just been built recently, so that was a big draw. But yeah, I think Breuer building changed a lot.
So at about this time, there's an impetus to move, part of it being that the building is going to be taken down, but also that in this meanwhile, Lowengrund has had an opportunity to think more strategically about the successes and the drawbacks to the operation as it stood, the ways in which she was constantly struggling for money, mounting so many exhibitions, and in so many ways had both a vital hub in the printmaking workshop, but in a lot of ways, as Christina mentioned, too little space, insufficient materials, and growing enthusiasm for the venture's growth. So after attempting to create partnerships throughout with different educational institutions, finding private backers with mixed successes, some do come on, but clearly not enough, she does in fact gain support from the foundation, and the Contemporaries is moved not too far away. The gallery moves to Madison at 77th, and the workshop moves to 3rd Avenue at 77th. And what was once a combined hybrid workshop and gallery space becomes a renamed Contemporaries Art Center within 2 spaces. And Christina, would you like to continue?
Yes, absolutely. So then Contemporaries Gallery is operating somewhat autonomously, but it does obviously have an affiliation with the Contemporaries workshop that's over on 3rd Avenue and 77th Street. And then in 1956, October, Pratt and the Contemporaries Graphic Art Workshop, so not the gallery, became a fused entity. It became known as the Pratt Contemporaries Graphic Art Center. And at that point, Margaret is still co-director of the workshop and directing the gallery. The Rockefeller Foundation was very worried about the commingling of commerce and education in a nonprofit workshop, and so this was how she ends up getting the grant, is that she sort of combines herself with Pratt, and then the gallery remains its own commercial entity. Unfortunately, Margaret died not too long after the merger. She had some kind of very aggressive, probably ovarian cancer, and died in November 1957. So she really didn't have that much of an opportunity to make a mark on what became, the Pratt Graphic Art Center, which had a 30-year history. But she definitely, I think, set the course forward for what the workshop would do, which was exhibitions, education, demonstrations, bringing in lecturers, guest instructors, guest printers. And so Pratt Graphic Art Center kind of emerges from this. It stays up on 3rd Avenue for a while, and then it moves downtown to larger quarters. And that's where I think a lot of people will remember it, is down on Lower Broadway.
There was some mention of them making some money as they went through the years by editioning work. So basically being contract printers for various artists, right?
So in about 1956, Lowengrund is needing to raise more money. Through this need, she enters into publishing for the first time. We have limited documentation of this new project, but what we do know is she thought of it as a print of the month club. She also drew upon existing networks of artists that she had long-standing relationships with, whether outside the Contemporaries itself, when she herself was still working as a printmaker, figures like Kurt Seligman, and people that she showed at the gallery who weren't necessarily working there, like Carol Summers, figures that she had met through her part-time life at the Woodstock Artist Colony, such as Adolf Den, and then artists who actually worked at the Contemporaries, like Sion Moy. And we do know that she executed projects, 3 or 4 prints, one certainly by Seligman, one by Den, one by Christina, do you recall?
Stuart Davis.
Well, I was going to go to that last.
Stuart
but there was,
Davis?
Yes, Stuart Davis.
Okay.
There was another one,
Carol Summers. We know Carol Summers. We have a suspicion about the Milton Avery.
That's the one.
That it's the bird, that lovely bird, the dove. We're fairly sure that's the print. That was the Contemporaries.
The one that's quite well known and is Stuart Davis's Detail Study for Cliché, which has found its way into numerous museum collections. What is exciting about this uncovery is that it really shows Margaret to be ahead of her time in thinking about print publishing and being, as we present her to be, the first woman to undertake this endeavor. That it only produced a handful of known editions doesn't diminish the great accomplishment in unfolding this project.
But she sounds amazing.
We allude to this, in the catalog, but she's often seen as the third leg of, Tatiana Grossman, June Wayne, and Margaret Lowengrund. And I think that's sort of maybe where I was first intrigued by who was Margaret Lowengrund. But then as we did more research, we realized that these 3 women actually did connect with one another in real ways, and that Margaret was this sort of foremother for those other 2, which is fascinating.
It's fascinating. The whole story is fascinating. So a lot of the artists that show up in the show, in the checklist that you will all see when you go to the print center are artists that are maybe lesser known, but if you've ever spent any time in a museum's print room, I was like, oh, that's why I know that guy. They were all at the Contemporaries, Yang Moy, and was Frasconi there? Did I dream that?
Mm-hmm. Frasconi's there, yeah.
Arthur Deshays, all those people. I'm like, oh, of course just like Atelier 17, they all kind of share an aesthetic, really. It's so fascinating.
I have to say that my interest in the 1950s really did stem from working in a print room as well. While we're required to have encyclopedic knowledge working in a print room, there are, many hits and favorites, a story of print history that we lean upon in order to teach people about the central importance of the medium and its unique history. Nevertheless, there were always these other prints that didn't come out for classes, that didn't make the highlight list, the hit lists that people wanted to see, but seemed equally as important in telling this unique story. And it was through the research and close looking at these works that sparked my interest in the 1950s. And I found it really wonderful when I met Christina that she had that interest as well, that curiosity about a history that's a little less documented, but was able in her own work to uncover it really efficiently and create a sense of what that world looked like. And that was very exciting to me. We actually met, in fact, while I was working at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, in the print room there. And we had some really wonderful conversations early on about this time period and about the work of this period. Figures like Dean Meeker or Kalapai, Lee Chesney, these are all artists who were working in Talia, working in lithography at a moment. And we did share a feeling as though, or a growing sense of understanding that there was a robust history that needed to be documented, pursued, and shared, that it was out there, that had popped up and been acknowledged or hinted at in various places. And it was just about pulling together those partial histories to try to tell a more full one. And we found a great agent in Lowengrund who really observed, participated, and then innovated within the 1950s.
I feel like everybody often thinks about the WPA, and then nothing happens. I mean, there's the WPA, there's Atelier 17, and then nothing happens until the late 1950s when ULAE opens. And it's like, there was a lot of stuff happening, and it wasn't for a while that ULAE really got going. And so this 1950s period, everybody thinks of it as this fallow period where nothing was getting done, but it's absolutely not.
I remember distinctly looking at the Dean Meekers and the Worden Days and in the storeroom and thinking, why can I not find anything, easily, readily available about this period at all? So I'm grateful to you guys for bringing this all together because it's filling a huge gap.
The 1950s was a period in which technical innovation was avant-garde for print. And that changes over time, what it means to be technically innovative, what it means to be avant-garde or contemporary. But it's very exciting to be able to share how technical innovation, aesthetic innovation was happening in this period for these artists and with these artists.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, the BMA, the Baltimore Museum, where I was for too many years, has several Arthur Deschay's prints that are really wonderful, fine, carved of some sort. And in your catalog, you note that they're wood engravings, but the BMA has 2 plexi plates. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he did both. But I just wanted to make a note, like all of this sort of experimentation and stuff, like you can go see these plates at the BMA's print room. You have to make an appointment. It's such fun stuff. I think it's so great.
Yeah. The way that Deschay's was working with the matrix and innovating on the matrix, a figure like Dean Meeker, was thinking about inks and pursuing viscosity in his screen print inks. And so the more we learned about the network of artists working at the Contemporaries, the more we were able to see the ways in which they were like-minded and why Lowengrund would have been attracted to them, because they were expanding upon the medium.
We have this great Dean Meeker in the show that's on gold paper. It's so amazing.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Mm-hmm. So that brings me, before I get to this second question, the first question I have is some of the pictures of the various workshops in the catalog are fantastic. And I see Coretta Kent in her nun's habit. But then I saw there's Bob Blackburn's in there. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. So that made me wonder, and some of these artists clearly siphon through Atelier 17 also, so that there must be this kind of, it feels like a melting pot to me, but probably not a good word. I don't know. But they all must have known each other and leaned on each other for help, right?
Oh, certainly. These are artists who are well familiar with each other's work through exhibitions, sharing information. As you said, it was a small but curious community of makers, and really did know of each other and work with each other in various ways. We have wonderfully been able to read through correspondence from artist to artist throughout the United States, which has really helped us recreate the kinds of relationships that were both professional and personal.
I would say that also they were competing. All of them were competing for funding, particularly as Atelier 17 closed. There was this kind of sense of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now the center is closed, and how are we going to recreate this magic? Bill Lieberman was very allied with the Rockefeller Foundation and sort of served as an informal advisor. And, I think that there was a sense that the Rockefeller Foundation knew that they needed to do something to support printmaking in the city, but it was just a question of who was the right vehicle to do it. And Margaret ended up being, the horse that won. But I have a feeling that there were a lot of people who, I think they even mentioned Blackburn in some of the Rockefeller Foundation correspondence. And I'm not sure why they were written off.
Well, Blackburn himself wasn't as interested in formalizing the printmaking workshop. His work as a printmaker, as well as a master printer, was really about the artist-to-artist connection and giving artists the space and the materials needed for them to be able to create their own work. If we think back to New York, printmaking in the 1950s, more often than not, the spaces available for professional printmakers were academic institutions, and aligning themselves with somebody like George C. Miller, a commercial printmaker who developed individual relationships with artists. So someone like Blackburn, who establishes his collective shop in 1947 with a whole host of other artists, was really about creating this alternative space, and a space where people can come and go as they please, could reciprocate and create alliance with one another. And so by the 1950s, he is less so interested in formalizing and making the kind of commercial commitments that somebody like Lowengrund initially makes, and then is forced to revise into a nonprofit and then eventually align herself with an educational institution. The other thing I was going to say was that, as many people likely know, is that it was in 1959, so not too long after the Rockefeller Foundation grant to Lowengrund, that June Weyl is able to secure a significantly larger amount of money from the Ford Foundation. If we think about these two women and their endeavors side by side, they were facing similar challenges. It was the timing of Weyl in the light of Lowengrund's accomplishments, who was then able to directly appeal to the Ford Foundation, and the kind of burgeoning acknowledgement of the foundation itself, the Ford Foundation itself, in its growing role as an agent of soft power and the supporting of the culture in the United States to really help Weyl envision her project at a significantly larger scale.
Yes, and the Pratt Graphic Art Center got a portion of
that's right.
That grant, yeah, which supported several artists coming from abroad to become visiting printers and instructors at the Pratt Graphic Art Center.
It's so funny because it's almost like the early Blackburn and waning Atelier 17 in New York, like they're maker spaces, and Lowengrund pulls everything together, and then it all splits up again with June Weyl and Tatiana. And I mean, it's kind of fascinating. She's like this little choke point where she sticks her stake in the sand and says, we're going to do it all. And then people are like, yeah, I can't do it all. I'm going to go do this one thing or this other thing. She's got it all.
I'm currently working on a dissertation at the Graduate Center, and it really is trying to understand the agents of change in the 1950s, each endeavoring a different approach to the same problem. Is how do we support a revival of lithography? And not in the kind of economic sense, but in the sense of how do we create opportunities to make prints? How do we create opportunities for artists to understand the vitality of this medium? And Lowengrund's endeavor was different than Blackburn's endeavor, which actually, in fact, was slightly different than Wayne's endeavor and quite different than the atelier model that ULA, takes on. And it was a process of exploration and took a lot of courage for each of them to stake their claim in what was then, a more dormant or a lower lying field. But we had the Una Johnson type people, like the Brooklyn Annuals and all that. Like there were people cheerleading, getting the word. It's so fascinating. There were really quite a number of these folks, and a lot of them, like Una Johnson, Gustav von Groschwitz in Ohio, they had themselves also longstanding commitments to the medium and were doing their parts within museums to really show and educate lay people, reinforce a national community of printmakers as well, and help them circulate their work. And it was really leaning on that robust network that allowed Lowengrund to share works from artists around the United States.
Yeah, I would say I'm very interested in Gustav von Groschwitz, who I guess everybody called Von, because those biennial color lithography shows that he put together are really important. And I don't feel like anybody really is thinking about them or what was being put in them, or, they were major undertakings. When you go to the show, because you're going to go to the show, we have this recording of Reginald Neal making a color lithography print. And so 2/3 of it is about that. And then like the last third is this like little preview of one of those shows that was organized by the Cincinnati Art Museum. And it's really interesting to see, the breadth of work that he's highlighting.
It sounds like another show on the horizon there, Christina.
Well,
I don't know. No.
Well, I have to say, similarly, Lowengrund was very attuned to the kind of work that Gustav von Groschwitz, that Von was doing in Ohio. And in our exhibition, we recreate one of Lowengrund's annuals that really took inspiration from the work that was happening in museums.
Yeah, she had these things called the Graphic Outlook, which were like comparable to the annuals at Brooklyn, where she had the best prints, contemporary prints of the year.
Were there other places in other regions of the States that were doing annual, biennial things?
What we can also look to in terms of precedent are the printmakers groups that were scattered throughout the United States, in the Northwest, in the Midwest, in New England. These self-organized groups were very active in drawing together the printmakers throughout their states or through their regions, and really were seen as viable and important platforms in the time.
It's fascinating. Has somebody written this? I'm sure somebody's written this, and I just haven't read it. The sort of the various forms that.
No one has written this.
Christina has done some of this lead work in her book, and I second with enthusiasm and your promotion of it, and also your article, Christina, for the Archives of American Art on networks in printmaking is really important, and I encourage people to start there.
Good plan. We'll put links in the show notes, and you all know about it. Christina's book, because I've yelled from the rooftops about it many a time. When I was looking through the catalog and just looking at the places that you were borrowing works from, I mean, it's so much work. I think people don't realize how much time and how many different places you have to go digging and reading letters. And I mean, it's insane how much, and nobody makes money doing this kind of project. Sorry, everybody. Surprise, surprise. I mean, it's insane and it's important work. So we ought to support it, people.
Yeah. No, I mean, we spent so many hours Zooming at the height of the pandemic, looking for, because we wanted to recreate very specific things. You could have put together a version of this show that was just artists who were at the Contemporaries. But for us, that wasn't really good enough. We wanted to know what works were actually there, right? So it was painstaking. And then once we identified a print, let's say, so many of these prints were never editioned. And so there's like 5 copies of these things. And one might be in a public institution, and the rest are who knows where. And it's like, yeah, it was impossible. So we're very grateful to our lenders and for the Print Center of New York for sponsoring this exhibition and making sure we could have loans from, the Whitney and from the Museum of Modern Art. And I'm not remembering where else.
The New York Public Library.
Oh my gosh, the New York Public Library has an amazing collection of this period of work. Definitely go check out their print room. One of the things that's so difficult about this topic is that there are no archives consolidated, because when Margaret died, so much of it, I think, just got thrown out. And Pratt really didn't keep any great records until later. I think everybody has written to the Pratt Institute archives saying, like, what do you have about this topic? And the archivist is like, not much. So it has been really fun to find it all.
But Pratt has really been a wonderful partner in letting us in to explore their archive, to look at the prints that remained from the art center. And I mean, we've done extensive research, as Christina said, throughout the lockdown, throughout quarantine, We were corresponding with the Archives of American Art, Syracuse University. We really went far and wide to learn anything we really could. The Rockefeller Archive Center upstate holds the papers of the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and those letters in which Margaret really pleads her case about her needs and her vision, this really remarkable vision, were fundamental for us being able to recreate what was going on in the workshop and in the gallery.
The Pratt archives have, we should put this in the show notes, these great negatives of what the workshop looked like. And we could only reproduce so much, but there are all these negatives, which are awesome. And people should definitely look at them. They're free to look at on JSTOR. Oh, families. We got to meet some like really wonderful families as a result of this. And one family, the Uchimas, they were amazing. The son, Anju, is the child of Toshiko and Ansei Uchima. And, you know, he was just really nice, really wonderful to talk to. There's a picture of him in one of those contact sheets as like a 4-year-old, 3-year-old sitting at an exhibition looking bored.
Yeah. And it's wonderful that a lot of the families that we contacted were so proud of their family members to have been accomplished artists, to have participated in this community of printmakers, and were so supportive and helpful in realizing the show.
When you were talking about the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation papers, it made me think more generously about the amount of stuff they make you put in those applications, because in the end, that is the thing that will stand as the record of what you were planning to do. And so whenever you're bitching and moaning about filling out grant applications, people, just remember that they will stand the test of time. So do it. It's kind of like signing and dating your work, you know, like it's the same kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
Be clear, write it all down.
Yes. And, you know,
do us a favor.
Equally insightful is back then the policy as it is probably as it is today. The foundations would get outside reviewers who would comment on these project proposals. And so it was equally interesting to see many of the folks in this extended network that we've already been talking about comment on one another's ambitions, check reality, or become real advocates. But you get to see the inner workings sometimes play out in these very official documents.
Oh, totally. Like Gabor Petterdy was a big fan of what was happening at Pratt, even though he was kind of going in his own direction in the academic world. He was on board of PGAC and like very, very supportive of Margaret's endeavors.
But also when, after she died, the Pratt was taken over by Fritz Eichenberg. Can you say a little bit about him? Because I find him fascinating.
Yeah, so Fritz, whose papers are at Yale and were a treasure trove of information about this topic, he was at Pratt from, I think, the late 1940s. He's a German immigrant, German Jew immigrant, and came to this country in the 30s and began working at Pratt, and then eventually was elevated to the role of chair of their graphic arts program. It was sort of kismet that he and Margaret met. He was teaching at the Contemporaries when it was over on 3rd Avenue. And when she sort of started to think about what the next iteration of the Contemporaries graphic art workshop would be, Fritz was there to sort of say, well, look, like at Pratt, we're looking to expand our program. And I really want to make this alliance happen. And he went to bat with Margaret and really made it possible for the Pratt administration to get behind the idea of having a Manhattan extension. The Pratt family, who were, and I think still are on the board, were a little bit unsure about leaving Brooklyn and having this workshop existing out in the middle of Manhattan. But Pratt ultimately got on board, I think through a lot of internal machinations that Eichenberg was managing. So the two of them were co-directors of the Pratt Contemporaries for that year that Margaret was still alive after the merger. And then he takes it over, and he really did steer the ship. He did an awful lot of work trying to make the workshop financially viable, whether that was getting institutions to sponsor scholarships, or reaching out to any number of funders to make the bottom line at the end of the year. And so ultimately, he, I think, stays there through the mid-60s, at which point he kind of stepped down and retired. And I think Jacob Landau was the one who took over the Pratt Graphic Art Center. And he was on the faculty at Pratt. Once the merger happens, there's this interesting commingling between people who were already kind of at the Contemporaries, but then very much this like staff of the Pratt Institute who start to teach at the Contemporaries or at the Pratt Graphic Art Center, like Walter Rogalski. I think that Deshays was also maybe on the faculty at Pratt. So there's a whole bunch of like overlap this happening. But Fritz is an interesting character.
Made some really wonderful prints.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, it's worth looking up.
So the exhibition, the way we've organized the exhibition is in 3 parts. The first part, you'll get introduced to Margaret, her own work as a printmaker. From there, you'll be introduced to the Contemporaries, seeing work by those who were on staff. You'll be introduced to the kinds of work shown in solo exhibitions. And then the aforementioned group show, the highlights show, as well as the video, the film that Christina references. And you'll learn a little bit more about the relationship between Woodstock, the Woodstock Artists Association, and the New York City Contemporaries. The third part of the show really does focus on Pratt. And you'll learn about the staff there, the staff at the workshop, its relationship to Pratt Institute. And then similarly, we recreate a large-scale exhibition that was held at the Jewish Museum, the ways in which Pratt responded to the changing climate in contemporary art, to not just focus on the printmaking community and the avant-garde artworks that were being produced there, but also the ways in which painters and sculptors were increasingly interested in printmaking, and were also looking to Pratt and its workshop to produce work in pop, op, conceptual art, and beyond. And so that additional section will show the ways in which that artwork intermingled at Pratt Graphics.
So how many things are in the show? A lot.
Yes, it's a large exhibition.
Yes. It's like 70 or something, right?
Roughly. We've got mostly prints, some ephemera, 1 sculpture by Peter Lippmann Wolf, and a painting by Margaret.
Oh, a painting. Oh, cool. Wait, how did you decide on a single sculpture, may I ask?
This goes back to scouring, looking really hard. So many of the sculptors seem amazing, and you can only find a tiny bit about them, like Jane Wazzy, Irene Hamar. I mean, these are not household names. They are not in survey texts about mid-century sculpture. They do not have papers, et cetera, et cetera. So we were very, very lucky to meet the daughter of Peter Lippmann Wolf, who lives out in Sag Harbor and is one of the keeper of that estate. And she was lovely to work with. And she found this sculpture actually also out on the east end of Long Island in a private collector's house. And so that is the sculpture that is coming to us.
Wow. More footwork, people. It takes a lot.
We also have to acknowledge that we were granted support from the Getty Foundation that allowed us to actually borrow these works, have them brought in, taken care of, framed, and put on view. That there could have been a version of the show, like Christina says, that does this topic justice, but it wasn't without strong foundation support that we were able to be this rigorous and exacting and really making the show as representative of what was taking place in the past as we were able to do.
Okay, so give us the numbers. So the show opens when and closes when at the Print Center, New York?
Looking at my calendar, it opens to the public on September 21st, and it continues through December 23rd, Saturday.
And the catalog, the first run, how many did they print? I mean, are we going to be worried about getting a copy?
I don't think so, but who knows? It's being published by, printed by Hermer in Munich, and then distributed through University of Chicago Press. So you can get your copy at University of Chicago Press. I'm sure that you can also get it from any number of places, bookshop, etc. I would get one early. I think there aren't that many copies of it.
It's going to be here several months to shine. All right. Anything else about the show that we should share with people?
No, thank you so much for having us.
Of course.
It's always lovely to chit chat with you.
Yes, thank you, Ann.
Oh, of course. Thanks, Lauren. People I'm sure know that Christina and I know each other because we have worked on Atelier 17 in parallel for a long time. So it's always a pleasure to see you. And Lauren, you're new to me, but I think you're lovely. So thank you for coming on Platemark.
I feel the same way.
Thank you. Yeah, she's, Margaret is an amazing character, and I'm really so glad that she's getting some time in the sun. It's awesome. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Platemark with Lauren Rosenblum and Christina Weyl, the curators of a model workshop, Margaret, Lowengrund, and the Contemporaries, on view at the Print Center, New York from September 21st through December 23rd, 2023. Now, again, the Print Center is on 24th Street, 535 West 24th Street, between 10th and 11th Avenues. You really should head over and see it before it leaves. And also you should buy the catalog, which has some really wonderful essays and fabulous images of the workshop and things that went on there. You can get the catalog over at the Print Center New York website, so head over there and click purchase. Okay, let's see what else. Oh, a reminder, if you love our content, please, I sound like an NPR announcer, but that's what I am. If you love our content, please consider donating to the cause. It's just me doing all of this, and I get no money for it. So head over to platemarkpodcast.com and hit the support and donate button and help me keep the lights on. I'd really appreciate it. A reminder also that any images we talk about are over in the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. You all know that by now. Before I let you go, I have to do my usual thank yous. First, to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Hi, Uncle Michael. Two, to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for his help with sound. It's terrible at it. And three, a thanks to Skip Barnhart and Lee Turner for the use of their studio sounds and my little intro soundscape. So thank you, everybody, for those. All right. And a thank you to Lauren and Christina because they were awesome guests. Thanks, you guys. So I guess that's it. We'll see you next time.